also know that the costs of these sections are fully paid for. I encourage all members to support this bill and to reserve the balance of my time. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Gentleman from California.
Thanks, Chair. And I ask for as much time as I may consume.
The gentleman is recognized.
And certainly I thank the members of the committee and Mr. Bilirakis for working in such a bipartisan manner to protect service members and protect veterans. And I think, Mr. Bilirakis, you gave a very comprehensive overview of the bill. Let me just make a couple of points here. The post-9/11 GI Bill, which a Democratic Congress passed a couple of years ago, was really a milestone for the our current crop of veterans. You know, almost 800,000 veterans of Iraq and Afghanistan have now made use of the benefits that this bill provides. So we ought to be, as a Congress, very proud of that kind of legislation. And with so many thousands of veterans using their post-9/11 GI Bill, it's important, obviously, that they understand their benefits and eligibility and have all the information available to them. And that's what H.R. 4057 does, which Mr. Bilirakis outlined quite nicely. So veterans are going to be able to get the kind of information that they need to get the best educational benefits that are suited to them. Let me just say one thing about the Section 4 of the bill, which authorizes the Department of VA to establish a burn pit registry for eligible veterans. Mr. Speaker, every time that we send men and women into combat, we have to make sure we understand the risk associated with exposures to toxic substances and take responsibility when we expose our own troops to these effects. We haven't done that in the past. We ought to learn more from history, whether it was atomic testing in World War II, whether it was Agent Orange in the Vietnam War, whether it was depleted uranium. We've done the same thing over and over again. We either denied or underestimated the risk. It took years, even decades, to admit the risk. And then when we finally did that, we still make our veterans undergo lots of bureaucratic hoops to get the benefits that come from exposure to the very substances that we put them at risk for. So let's not repeat that pattern. And this open pit registry will be part of that effort. We want to understand the risks. We want people to know where they have been exposed. I requested the General Accountability Office to help us in our efforts to better understand health risks associated with the burn pits in Iraq and Afghanistan. And we all know that the preliminary reports have shown that the fumes from these pits produce a considerable amount of contaminants that may cause short and long-term harm to our service members. So finally, we are having a proactive measure, and one which I hope will benefit veterans in an extremely positive way. I thank Mr. Bilirakis and his colleagues for working with our colleagues for the bill, and I would reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves the balance of his time. Gentleman from Florida.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'm happy to yield 3 minutes to a senior member of the Veterans Committee, my good friend from Florida, Mr. Stearns.
Gentleman from Florida is recognized for 2 minutes.
I thank my distinguished chairman and colleague. I rise today in support of H.R. 4057, the Improving Transparency of Education Opportunities for Veterans Act of 2012, that's been offered by my colleague from Florida, Gus Bilirakis. My colleagues, this bill would provide veterans and service members the resources that they need to make informed decisions when choosing the right institution or school for the career they wish to pursue. The other provisions included would help veterans with state certification credentials for skills acquired while on active duty. Ensures homeless veterans have access to shelters in compliance with the state and local codes, and would require the Secretary to establish and maintain a burn pit registry program for individuals who may have been exposed to toxic chemicals. During the committee markup, I offered an amendment that would limit the amount the VA would pay in performance award to senior staff from fiscal year 2013 to 2017 to adequately cover the costs associated with H.R. 4057, along with the provisions included from the other 3 bills. My colleagues, in the last 3 years, during the worst economic climate this country has seen since the Great Depression, Almost 800,000 VA employees receive monetary awards totaling $1.1 billion. This limitation amendment I offered affects only the senior executive services, the SES as they're called, who are considered to be like the generals of the federal workforce and make between $120,000 and $180,000 a year. The VA has an agency that has underperformed, yet they continue to provide performance bonuses at the expenses of taxpayers and the well-being of our veterans. Today's VA's backlog stands at 840,000 claims, of which more than 55% have been pending for more than 125 days. It is unconscionable that these senior executive employees are receiving bonuses averaging $40,000 a year on top of their six-figure salaries when the number of backlog claims is close to the number of the monetary awards given. Today, on September 11th, is a day every American will never forget. I urge all my colleagues to support passage of this bill, and by doing so we honor our veterans and service members by supplying them with these needed resources to help rebuild their lives. Mr. Speaker, today is a day we'll never forget. We'll always remember the sacrifices of those brave men and women, and passage of this bill will remind everybody of our appreciation for them. Thank you, Mr.
Gentleman yields back. The gentleman reserves the balance of his time. Gentleman from California.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would recognize our ranking member of the Health Subcommittee, gentleman from Maine, a fighter for Veterans Affairs, Representative Michaud.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to thank the gentleman for his strong support for veterans over the years and look forward to continue work with him through the rest of this Congress. Mr. Speaker, I rise today as a co-sponsor and a strong supporter of this bill. Each section of it makes important changes that will improve the care and services we provide our veterans. I'm especially proud that it creates a comprehensive educational outreach policy, recognizes that military service meets the standards of many civilian job certification, and that it establishes an open burn pit registry. All three of these provisions are the results of the hard work of veterans and their advocates. I had many meetings with veterans who not only identified these issues, but they also provided solutions for the issues as well. In my time as serving on the House Veterans Affairs Committee, I've always appreciated that it's one of the places in Congress where bipartisan efforts are working and things do get done. And I'm pleased that this is the tradition in this particular bill as well. I want to thank all of my colleagues on the Veterans Affairs Committee, Chairman Miller of the full committee, and Chairman Burkle of the Health Care Subcommittee, and Tim Waltz, who's also been a true advocate for veterans issues, and thank him for his service as well for this great nation of ours. And I would encourage my colleagues to support H.R. 4057, and I yield back the remainder of my time.
Gentleman yields back. The gentleman from California reserves the balance of his time. Gentleman from Florida.
Mr. Speaker, I'm happy to yield as much time as she may consume. Chairwoman of the Subcommittee on Health, my good friend Ms. Burkle, from New York.
Gentlewoman from New York is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today in support of H.R. 4057 as amended, the Improving Transparency of Education Opportunities for Veterans Act of 2012. As we all know, 11 years ago this morning on September the 11th, 2001, our country was forever changed when terrorist attacks on American soil resulted in the deaths of over 3,000 innocent souls. And since that time, we've been tested like never before. And thanks to the brave service and sacrifices of our nation's armed forces, have emerged as a nation stronger, better, and more resolved to advancing the cause of freedom around the world. We also have emerged a more grateful nation, ever mindful of the simple truth that the security and freedoms we enjoy were bought and paid for by the blood, sweat, and tears of those in uniform. Caring for and honoring these heroes is one of our nation's most sacred obligations and the primary purpose of this bill before us today. H.R. 4057 as amended includes two provisions originating from the Subcommittee on Health, of which I am honored to chair. Section 3 of the bill would require per diem payment recipients under the Department of VA Homeless Grant and Per Diem Program to provide the VA with a certification of compliance with the Life Safety Code or the International Fire Code and other relevant fire safety building codes in their jurisdiction. This provision would also require the VA to include an accounting and evaluation of the safety and accessibility of facilities used to provide programs for homeless vets in the annual report on assistance to homeless veterans. Current law requires the VA to ensure that entities receiving grants under the Homeless Grant and Per Diem Program meet fire and safety codes. However, VA lacks a similar requirement to ensure per diem recipients are also compliant with these very important codes. When one of our honored veterans finds him or herself homeless and makes the difficult decision to get help, we must ensure that they are provided the services they need in a safe, secure, and supportive environment. This section of the bill would allow us to do so in a much more comprehensive, effective, and efficient manner. This provision was introduced by my good friend and colleague from West Virginia, David McKinley, and I thank him for his leadership and his advocacy on behalf of the homeless veterans struggling to rebuild their lives. Section 4 of the bill would direct the VA to establish and maintain an open burn pit registry for veterans of Iraq and Afghanistan who may have been exposed to toxic chemicals and fumes caused by open burn pits during deployment. This provision would also require the VA to develop a public information campaign to inform eligible veterans of the registry and periodically notify them of significant developments in the study and treatment of the conditions that may be associated with burn pit exposure. Further, it would direct the VA to contract with an independent scientific organization to develop a report on the effectiveness of actions taken to collect and maintain information on the health effects of burn pit exposure and submit the completed report to Congress. I've heard from countless veterans who returned home from a war consumed with concern about the air they breathed in the battle, which was often filled with smoke from the burning of solid waste and could affect their health and well-being. With this provision, we will take the first steps towards recognizing and respecting these concerns of our veterans. Importantly, it will also allow us to gather data necessary to discovering new and better ways to care for our veterans today and in the future generations. In closing, I would like to offer my sincere gratitude and appreciation to all of the members who sponsored the provisions included in this legislation. I also would like to thank the ranking member on the Health Subcommittee, Mr. Michaud from Maine, for his support in all of the work on behalf of our veterans. I urge all of my colleagues to join me in supporting this legislation. On this day of all days, it is so very important that we support the service members and veterans who have fought for the greatest nation in the history of mankind, the United States of America. I yield back my time.
Gentlewoman yields back. Gentleman reserves the balance of his time. Gentleman from California.
Yeah, I would like to yield 3 minutes to the gentleman from Minnesota, the Sergeant Major of the United States Congress, Mr. Walz.
Gentleman from Minnesota is recognized for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'd like to thank the ranking member. Veterans have had no greater friend since his time here, and we're grateful for the work he's done. To Mr. Bilirakis and the entire committee for what has been said by several of my colleagues. It's fitting and appropriate today that we're passing legislation to serve those who have served us. It also is fitting and appropriate that we conduct ourselves in a manner fitting of their service. This committee is one, as Mr. Michaud said and so many others have said, we're proud of the work we do together, and this is just another example. I'd like to comment just briefly on Section 2 of this, that my good friend and friend of veterans from Ohio, Mr. Stivers, has been an absolute outspoken untiring advocate to make sure that we employ these veterans when they come home. And last month, President Obama signed in another bill of ours, the Veterans Skills to Job Act, that is now the law of the land, making it easier to credential our veterans when they come back. This nation spends $140 billion training our veterans. These are our best and brightest and most dedicated. When they come back home, they're not victims, but we certainly know there are barriers to employment that we should not be putting up in front of them. If they've driven that truck and served served this nation in Afghanistan, why should we have to repay to get a CDL license? If they've saved their colleagues on the battlefield and passed the credentialing to be a medic, why can't they ride in an ambulance at the Mayo Clinic in my district? And this bill takes it to the next level and sets that credentialing and coordination between the federal and state to make sure when our veterans return home that we're not putting barriers in front of them, and to be quite honest, that we're not spending precious resources, whether it's giving them unemployment insurance or retraining them through redundant trainings that in many cases in my office, my veteran staffer was the SHAPE commander's pilot, Black Hawk pilot in Europe, and he was the top trainer in the military. If he came back out civilian-wise, he would have to go to a 48-month course to be able to get through some of these things. That makes no sense, and it's putting our veterans at a disadvantage. So I want to thank Mr. Stivers for making this possible. The transition can be there. I also want to thank our states who have been so willing to work with us. There's 8 states have already implemented this proposal. It will make it easier. It's the right thing to do for our veterans. It will give employers great, dependable employees, and it'll make sure these veterans do what we know is the best for their mental health, for their family, and for this country, get back to work and start doing the things that they want to do. So with that, I thank everyone involved for this great bill. I encourage my colleagues to support 4057, and I yield back my time.
Gentleman yields back. The gentleman from California reserves the balance of his time. Gentleman from Florida.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, I'm happy to yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Stivers, a veteran of Operation Iraqi Freedom.
Gentleman from Ohio is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you. I'd like to thank the gentleman for yielding, and I'd like to thank my colleague from Minnesota, Mr. Walz, for his help as we've tried to enact the Hire at Home Act, which has been rolled into this bill. The legislation came from a roundtable in my district of veterans last fall, and as veterans return home today with military training they've received, that training is not recognized by civilian authorities and states, and therefore they're forced to go through redundant training to do the job they were doing in the military. However, if somebody can do a job while serving in a war zone, they can certainly do that same job at home in a safe environment. And with so many veterans returning home from Iraq and Afghanistan, we need to make sure we can do everything we can to help get them back to work. It's shameful that the unemployment rate among veterans, post-9/11 veterans, is 12.7%, according to a recent report of the Bureau of Labor Statistics. That's why we introduced the Hire at Home Act. It will, as Representative Walz said, remove barriers in front of these soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines, and get them the civilian certifications they need to get them to work as soon as they get home. It forces states to do this by ensuring that in order to receive certain grants, workforce development grants, they have to streamline these certifications. I would like to thank all those who've helped make this bill happen today, Representative Walz, Representative Bilirakis, Representative Miller, Representative Stetson, and I'd like to thank Senator Pryor for his interest in the Senate. I'd like to call on the United States Senate to pass this bill as soon as we get it done. I'd like to thank the members of this body for their support and urge all the members to support this legislation. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Florida continues to reserve.
Mr. Speaker, I have no further speakers and would yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman from California yields back the balance of his time. Gentleman from Florida.
Mr. Speaker, how much time do I have left?
6 minutes.
Okay. Mr. Speaker, I yield 3 minutes to the gentleman, Mr. McKinley from West Virginia.
Gentleman from West Virginia is recognized for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Congressman Bilirakis and Chairman Miller, for bringing this bill to the floor today. Let me take this opportunity to highlight a segment of the portion dealing with safe housing for homeless veterans. I previously sponsored this concern in a separate piece of legislation, and it was subsequently amended into this bill that's before us today. Currently, there are 2,100 community-based homeless veterans service providers across the country, and many other homeless assistance programs that have demonstrated impressive success reaching homeless veterans. I visited some of the shelters in my home district in West Virginia and was struck by how many were not, unfortunately, in compliance with state, local, or federal building and fire codes. Consequently, we began to investigate how broad-based this issue was across America. It was unsettling to learn about shelter fires where lives have been lost. Stories of a homeless shelter where fire where occupants were killed due to the fact that there was not a required sprinkler system at the facility, or where dozens were injured when a sprinkler system was not working properly, or where doors were closed that needed to be opened. All of these could have been avoided. Unfortunately, there is no law mandating a homeless shelter meet building and fire safety codes, only a policy within the VA. As a licensed professional engineer, I found this to be an egregious omission in the law concerning homeless shelters for veterans. The language in this bill would require any organization that seeks funding for VAs for services to homeless veterans to have documentation that their building meets or exceeds all building codes. This is common sense legislation that could ensure the well-being of veterans all across America who have fallen on hard times and are in need of the most assistance. As a nation, it should be unacceptable for us to allow homeless veterans to be housed in potentially unsafe conditions. I appreciate the support of this legislation and this provision from the American Legion, the Homeless Veterans Coalition, the International Code Council, and the Fire Marshals Council in the association. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for including this language in the bill today and for your concern for the safety and the living environment of our veterans. I yield back my time.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from
Continue to
Florida.
reserve.
Gentleman from Florida retains the remaining time.
Okay. All right. Why don't I'm happy to yield 2 minutes to the chairman of the Subcommittee on Economic Opportunity, the gentleman from Indiana, Mr. Stutzman.
Gentleman's recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Bilirakis, for yielding. Mr. Speaker, I rise today in strong support of H.R. 4057 as amended. This is a bipartisan bill that at its core will help our youngest group of veterans make more informed choices about how to use their VA education benefits. I think it's very appropriate today that as we remember 9/11 and those who died that day and those who have died since defending our nation, that we are discussing this bill on the floor. The post-9/11 GI Bill is a wonderful benefit that thousands of veterans are using or have used to advance their education and training. H.R. 4057 will further assist these veterans in making decisions on how to best use their GI Bill benefits through new innovative online tools and by providing greater transparency on certain data from educational institutions. By helping these veterans make more informed choices, we are not only putting them on the path to successful careers, but we are saving taxpayer dollars that may have been misused at a training program that didn't suit the veterans' needs. As chairman of the Subcommittee on Economic Opportunity, I'm proud of the work that Mr. Bilirakis, Mr. Braley, and the rest of the members of the subcommittee have done to improve this bill, and thanks to our colleagues on the Health Subcommittee for their provisions as well. I want to thank Chairman Miller and the ranking member for their support of this legislation, and I yield back the balance of my time and ask my colleagues to support the bill.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Florida.
Mr. Speaker, once again, I encourage all members to support H.R. 4057 as amended, and I yield back the balance of my time. Thank you.
Gentleman from Florida yields back. The question is, will the House suspend the rules and pass H.R. 4057 as amended? Those in favor say aye. Those opposed say no. The opinion of the Chair, 2/3 being in the affirmative, the rules are suspended. The bill is passed. And without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table. Would have been nice. For what purpose does the gentleman from New York seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I move that the House suspend the rules and pass H.R. 3857 as reported by the Committee on Homeland Security.
Clerk will report the title of the bill.
Union Calendar number 351, H.R. 3857, a bill to amend the implementing recommendations of the 9/11 Commission of 2007 to require the Secretary of Homeland Security to include as an eligible use the sustainment of specialized operational teams used by local law enforcement under the Transit Security Grant Program and for other purposes.
The Chair understands that the gentleman called up the bill as amended. Pursuant to the rule, the gentleman from New York, Mr. Turner, and the gentleman from Mississippi, Mr. Thompson, will each control 20 minutes. The Chair recognizes the gentleman from New York.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that all members have 5 legislative days within which to revise and extend their remarks and include any extraneous material on the bill under consideration.
Without objection, so ordered.
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself as much time as I may consume.
Gentleman's recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today to urge the passage of H.R. 3857, the Public Transportation Security and Local Law Enforcement Support Act, which helps local law enforcement meet national security demands in a troubled economy. Today, we solemnly remember the tragedy which took place 11 years ago at the Pentagon, in Shanksville, Pennsylvania, and New York City. I am personally reminded when I travel from my home to New York, from New York to D.C., I look toward the southern tip of Manhattan where the Twin Towers once stood. As we also remember the brave New York firefighters and police officers who ran into the inferno of the World Trade Center with no regard for their own safety. We should think about the brave spirit that lives on in every first responder. They are truly our last line of defense in an increasingly dangerous world, and we should make sure they are provided with access to all the resources they need to keep us safe. In large metropolitan areas, public transit systems are among the most vulnerable targets. In New York City, the MTA carries over 8 million people daily on its subways and buses throughout the 5 boroughs. The Transit Security Grant Program provides funds to public transit agencies in high-risk areas for various security projects, including the hiring of full-time personnel for specialized anti-terrorist teams, K-9 units, mobile screening, and public awareness campaigns. The program is authorized by the implementing recommendations of the 9/11 Commission Act of 2007 and administered by the Federal Emergency Management Agency in consultation with the Transportation Security Administration. Grant funds are used to create new specialized anti-terror teams, but until recently could not be used to sustain these teams unless the Department of Homeland Security provided a waiver. This forced law enforcement to face the uncertainty of the waiver process or risk losing vital security assets. Fortunately, the Secretary provided some relief last year so that a waiver was not required, but without this bill, there's nothing to stop the Department of Homeland Security from reinstating another bureaucratic waiver or a process. H.R. 3857 streamlines the grant program to make it easier for the specialized security teams to receive funding. It authorizes the Department of Homeland Security to provide transit security grant programs to sustain teams and also eliminate the bureaucratic steps of requiring eligible transit agencies to apply for a waiver. This will help avoid countless hours of request preparation and review. I urge my colleagues to support this bill because there is nothing more important than protecting our citizens. We must make it a priority to ensure that the brave men and women who work so hard to keep us safe have the resources they need, and as soon as they need it. Thank you, and I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman from New York reserves the balance of his time. Gentleman from Mississippi.
Mr. Speaker, I rise in support of H.R. 3857, the Public Transit Security and Local Law Enforcement Support Act, and yield myself as much time as I may consume.
Gentleman's recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, as the President stated in his weekly address, the anniversary of 9/11 is a time to honor and commemorate first responders, the victims of the attacks, and the members of the armed forces serving at home and abroad. It's unfortunate that the Republican majority has decided to discontinue the House's tradition of doing just that by considering a resolution honoring the fallen and commending our nation's bravest on this day. For years, majority leaders of both parties have introduced and scheduled consideration of a 9/11 resolution. Surely, if the House has the time to consider the 32 bills scheduled for consideration on the suspension calendar this week, it has the time to commemorate our nation's first responders, the victims of 9/11, and our troops by considering a resolution doing just that. Even if some politicians would prefer not to mention it, our nation is still at war with Afghanistan. Our troops are still in harm's way, a half a world away, fighting a war that was the direct result of the terrorist attacks of 9/11. Accordingly, I would urge the Republican leadership of the House to reconsider their decision to forego consideration of a 9/11 resolution this day. As the legislation under consideration today, I support this bill that, thanks to an amendment offered by Representative Jackson Lee during committee consideration, authorizes $400 million for the Transit Security Grant Program. The Transit Security Grant Program provides funds to state and local jurisdictions that need help keeping their transportation systems secure. As state and local budgets continue to face the strain of recovering from the economic collapse that occurred during the previous administration, we have a responsibility to ensure that they have the funding needed to build and sustain the capacity to protect against a terrorist attack. As amended, H.R. 3857 does just that. With that, Mr. Speaker, I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves the balance of his time. Gentleman from New York.
I reserve my time.
Gentleman reserves.
Mr. Speaker, I recognize for as much time as she may consume the gentlelady from Houston, Texas, Ms. Jackson Lee.
The gentlewoman from Texas is recognized.
Let me thank Mr. Turner and the ranking member, Mr. Thompson, for their courtesies of yielding to me and allow me to take this moment on the floor, 9/11, to again acknowledge the members of Congress who this morning joined each other, if you will, with two houses that came together on the East Steps to be able to acknowledge those who were lost, and I'd like to say those who still live in the backdrop of the tragedy. For many are still pained by the loss of their family members, as we know in New York, the reading of the names, and of course the laying of the wreath that occurred today at the Pentagon. We cannot get those lives back, and what we recognize is that those lives represented places around the world, but it also represented moms and dads, and children today have grown up without those loved ones because of the horrific and heinous tragedy. And some might say America's naivete, but I'm glad to live in a country that believes in her freedom. I'm glad to live in a country of which we claim democracy and understand it, and understand the freedom of speech and freedom of access, freedom of association. I would not want to live anywhere else. But we were pained on that day because they attempted to take our naivete away from us, our innocence. And I am glad that we came together, both in terms of allowing people now still to travel from the east to the west, from the north to the south, to have summer vacations, to lay out in the open sun. This is our nation. And I am grateful for having the privilege of serving on the Homeland Security Committee. I hold this flag just to indicate that this is a great nation. I'd like to thank our early persons who led this committee, certainly Mr. Chris Cox, Mr. Jim Turner, the Homeland Security Select Committee and members who were on that committee. And I want to acknowledge my outstanding ranking member, Mr. Thompson, who has been a great leader on these issues. He has been diligent, he has been patriotic, he has been loving of his country, and along with the chairman, Mr. King, who has worked for the common good as we have tried to work together. It has not been a perfect unity because we have had disagreements, and many of us disagree in the interpretation of democracy and civil liberties, but we all believe in one nation under God, but more importantly, the security of this nation. Mr. Thompson, I want to thank you for allowing me to serve with you and for your leadership. It is in that spirit that I rise today to speak to H.R. 3857, which amends the implementing recommendations of the 9/11 Commission Act of 2007. And I might just say, Mr. Turner, that there were those of us who were here, and you come from New York, and so I know that more than likely there were people in and around your area, even though you're upstate New York, or not in the Queens area, excuse me, who lost their lives, or family members. And so we acknowledge the regions that were impacted, from Boston to New York to Pennsylvania, and certainly those families whose family members were on those airlines. We understand but cannot feel the deep pain that they have today. The 9/11 Commission, of course, came about mainly through the many families that walked the halls. And let me, of course, acknowledge those families who, even in their pain again, came to the halls of Congress and asked us to do something. And so this is particular legislation is amending the 9/11 Commission Act of 2007 to allow grants that are to be eligible for public transportation agencies for security improvements to be used for specialized patrol teams, including the sustainment of such teams without fiscal year limitation, as long as the agency applying for grant funds submits a sustainment plan for maintaining in future years the capability or the capacity achieved with these funds. That is a good step. It allows local jurisdictions to expand their services as long as they're able to sustain it. In January 2007, soon after Democrats took control of the House after being in the minority, I joined with my colleagues across both sides of the aisle, and we passed the 9/11 Commission Act of 2007. This legislative landmark was critical in strengthening our nation's homeland security efforts. Specifically, the 9/11 Act established the Transportation Security Grant Programs, which provides a vital source of funding for our transportation systems across the United States. Shortly thereafter, I remember a conference where the House and Senate came together, and I remember the opportunity to establish transportation security centers of excellence. I am grateful that we established one at Texas Southern University Historically Black College, among other historically black colleges, where we looked at ways of improving transportation security. Having just been briefed by Texas Southern University, I know that they are finishing their work, and I want to thank the team that led on that program. Those funds were truly used productively, efficiently, and effectively to provide new technology and new techniques, vetting procedures on how we can truly secure America. Since the demise of Osama bin Laden, led by the outstanding military of the United States of America, guided, directed, of course, by the Commander-in-Chief, President Obama, and the excellent military leadership, National Security Agency that provided all of the guidance for this enormous task, it has been revealed in the public domain that terrorists continue to be interested in developing plots to sabotage mass transit systems and, of course, the aviation system. This threat, however, is not new. Today, as I indicated, marks the 11th anniversary since the 9/11 attacks, and as such, we must take every step to commemorate the men and women we lost on that day. We also have the responsibility to make sure that we do not allow another catastrophic loss of life like the one we faced that day. In the course of the years since 9/11, we have seen incidences in London and Spain. We've seen incidences in Mumbai, tragic incidents on mass transit. We've also seen the individual efforts that have been made to bring down another airline over American soil, or certainly en route to the United States of America. Therefore, it is imperative that we, Congress, examine how the Department of Homeland Security and the Transportation Security Administration are addressing the current and evolving threat to our transportation systems, and continue to support programs that have yielded a positive security impact, such as TSA's Transportation Security Grant Program. I have seen in my own transit system the utilization of these funds. I've seen the utilization as it has been very effective in K-9 units. Let's come together around recognizing that the security of America is holistic. First, of course, the frontliners, meaning the United States military. Then, of course, the men and women who overlap in jurisdiction under Homeland Security, the many different law enforcement that every day work on the border, work on internal enforcement, work at airports, coalesce and collaborate with the FBI and DEA and ATF and others around the question of security. I am glad these programs are being expanded for security purposes, for efficiency purposes, for utilization of our tax dollars in the right way. And that is why I'm pleased to see the majority and the ranking member, along with the members of the Democratic part of the committee, at my request and submission of an amendment, accepted my amendment during committee consideration to authorize $400 million for the Transportation Security Grant Program for FY12 and FY13. This funding will ensure that transportation agencies have the resources needed to secure our public and mass transit system. I would argue that it complements what we're doing in aviation, which together maintains the nucleus, if you will, of transportation security. So I'm hoping that this will move quickly through the United States Senate and find itself on the President's desk. It is crucial. I then hope that my colleagues can come together for us to put on the floor the Transportation Security Administration reauthorization. We've done it before. I know we can do it now. And I'd ask my colleagues to come together in the name not only of security, but the families, the 9/11 Commission, who now bear the brunt of that tragic day, along with so many others. Thank you to our first responders, and of course to the men and women who now serve around the world and those who have come home. I ask my colleagues to support H.R. 3857. With that, I yield back.
Gentlewoman yields back. The gentleman reserves.
Yes.
The gentleman reserve his time?
I reserve.
Gentleman reserves the balance of his time. Gentleman from New York.
Mr. Speaker, I have no more speakers. If the gentleman from Mississippi has no further speakers, I am prepared to close once the gentleman does.
Gentleman reserves the balance of his time.
Mr. Speaker, I have no more speakers. If the gentleman from New York has no more speakers, then I'm prepared to close.
Gentleman's recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself as much time as I may consume.
Gentleman's recognized.
Mr. Speaker, on this day, above all others, we turn our thoughts to those who were lost in the tragic events of 9/11. It is unfortunate that the Republican leadership of the House has decided not to continue this body's tradition of considering a resolution to commemorate first responders, the victims of the attack, and members of the armed forces serving at home and abroad. Mr. Speaker, I urge my colleagues to join me in calling for the consideration of a 9/11 resolution and support H.R. 3857. H.R. 3857 authorizes funds critical to ensuring our nation's transportation systems are secure. It does so to the tune of $400 million, dollars that state and local jurisdictions desperately need. With that, Mr. Speaker, I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from New York.
Mr. Speaker, I urge members to support the bill, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. The question is, will the House suspend the rules and pass H.R. 3857 as amended? Those in favor say aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, two-thirds being in the affirmative. Gentleman from Mississippi.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, on that, I request the yeas and nays.
Yeas and nays are requested. All those in favor of taking this vote by the yeas and nays will rise and remain standing until counted. The sufficient number having risen, the yeas and nays are ordered. Pursuant to Clause 8 of Rule 20, further proceedings on this question will be postponed. For what purpose does the gentleman from Illinois seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I move that the House suspend the rules and pass H.R. 6028 as amended.
Clerk will report the title of the bill.
H.R. 6028, a bill to authorize the Assistant Secretary of Homeland Security, Transportation Security Administration to modify screening requirements for checked baggage arriving from pre-clearance airports and for other purposes.
Pursuant to the rule, the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Walsh, and the gentleman from Mississippi, Mr. Thompson, will each control 20 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Illinois.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield myself such time as I may consume.
Gentleman's recognized.
I ask unanimous consent that all members may have 5 legislative days within which to revise and extend their remarks and include extraneous material on the bill under consideration.
Without objection, so ordered.
Mr. Speaker, earlier this year I introduced H.R. 6028, the No Hassle Flying Act, which is a very simple bill that streamlines baggage security measures for international flights. Over the past decade, the U.S. Customs and Border Patrol has designated 14 international airports as pre-clearance airports. They are located in Canada, the Caribbean, and Ireland, and continue to exhibit comparable security standards to ours right here in the United States. When passengers originate from one of these airports and fly into the U.S., they are not required to go through security again because they have already been fully vetted. Unfortunately, an ambiguity in U.S. law does not exempt their bags as well. U.S. law today requires all baggage entering the United States to be rescreened by a TSA agent regardless of where it originates. That means that passengers, often on short or late-night layovers, must exit security, claim their bags from baggage claim, recheck them, and go through security again. This double security does not equal double safety. It equals missed flights, more hassles, and it wastes taxpayer dollars. Therefore, all this bill does is give CBP and TSA the authority to exempt baggage coming from one of those 14 pre-clearance airports from being rescreened as well. This issue was brought to my attention by TSA, and H.R. 6028 has come together with a great deal of their help. I would like to also especially thank the staffs of Representatives Thompson and Sheila Jackson-Lee for helping improve upon this bill. With their help, H.R. 6028 has been redrafted to clarify the intent of the bill, which is that baggage originating only from pre-clearance airports can enter the United States without being rescreened. As TSA and CBP gravitate toward more efficient risk-based security measures instead of 100% blanket checks, this type of bipartisan legislation will make that process easier. It will also save travelers time and allow security officers to focus on higher-risk baggage from overseas locations. I also want to thank Subcommittee Chairman Rogers and his staff for their assistance on this bill. I urge members to vote in support, and I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from Mississippi.
Mr. Speaker, I rise in support of H.R. 6028, the No Hassle Flying Act of 2012, and yield myself such time as I may consume.
Gentleman's recognized.
Mr. Speaker, while I support the legislation we are considering today, I'm concerned that on this, the anniversary of the terrorist attack of September 11th, we are not considering a bipartisan package of legislation. On this day, 11 years ago, our country was attacked and came together like never before to face the immense challenges of rebuilding and restructuring our security systems. With the creation of the 9/11 Commission, the Transportation Security Administration, and ultimately the Department of Homeland Security, we demonstrated that Homeland Security is an American issue, not a partisan one. Why then, I must ask, are we not considering a bipartisan package of legislative proposals that have previously received the unanimous support of the Committee on Homeland Security? Why is this bill, which never received committee consideration, being put on the House floor ahead of H.R. 1165, the Transportation Security Administration Ombudsman Act? That bill, introduced by Representative Jackson-Lee, received the unanimous support of the Committee on Homeland Security. Despite that, it has sat idle on the Union calendar for over 10 months. Why are we not considering H.R. 6328, a thoughtful proposal introduced by Representative Hochul that would require TSA to transfer unclaimed clothing found at security checkpoints to veterans in need. With the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan that were fought in the aftermath of 9/11 over and coming to an end, respectively, I could think of no appropriate legislation for this body to consider today than a bill aimed at supporting our veterans. Mr. Speaker, I support the bill we are considering today because it is a common-sense proposal that will make air travel more convenient for a select few and has the potential to enhance efficiencies. When we can eliminate duplicative screening without compromising security, I will lend my support. Accordingly, I support this legislation that the Obama administration proposed and a gentleman from Illinois, Representative Walsh, introduced. With that, Mr. Speaker, I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Illinois.
Mr. Speaker, I'm prepared to reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from Mississippi.
Mr. Speaker, I yield for as much time as she may consume. The gentlelady from Texas, Ms. Jackson Lee.
Gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Let me thank the ranking member for his courtesies of extending the time, and let me acknowledge the gentleman from Illinois for the work on this bill and working with my office. At the first glance, though this has been proposed by the Obama administration, one would wonder why we were lessening any oversight over baggage. But this is a process that I think is in compliance with all of our commitment to safety and security, and in particular on this day. I do appreciate the fact that there are certain airports of which this will cover, that this responds in particular to friends to the north of us, Canada, which has the most sophisticated technology, and a number of other airports. Also, I think because of the oversight of the Secretary of Homeland Security, in case there is a need to review this particular process, which allows for a bag of an entering person to continue on with them as they come into the country, going on to their domestic location. This is, again, an item of trust, but also an item of technology and an item of oversight. This is an administrative proposal that came by way of the White House in order to establish an administrative process through which the flying public can travel with minimum security disruption. I always emphasize, however, the importance of ensuring in the most highest of responsibilities the security of this nation. I believe that we, as Congress, have the responsibility to ensure that aviation security is not compromised through any efforts that ease travel for the flying public. The Obama administration has taken great strides in enhancing our transportation security, particularly that in aviation. Although Osama bin Laden, as I've repeated before on this floor, is dead, the threat to our aviation safety and security continues to evolve because we're well aware of franchise terrorism. Not only did the administration lead a successful attack to remove one of the most dangerous terrorists in the world, the Obama administration has also taken significant steps to enhance policies that protect the American flying public. In December, the Department will successfully meet a congressional cargo screening mandate of screening 100% cargo aboard passenger flights traveling in the United States and those inbound to the United States from foreign countries. This is a noteworthy accomplishment since several in Washington, D.C. touted that it could not be done. It's a day of celebration. It's something that the 9/11 families welcome. Today marks 11 years since we experienced a devastating loss of life, and 9/11 marked all of our lives by exposing doubts. But as I indicated in my earlier statement, this is a great country. And, of course, we continue to emphasize not only our democracy, but our rights, along with our security. There is no doubt today that we are resilient and that we're survivors. Let's not forget the progress we've made in transportation security policies, and we must continue to support measures that take us forward. That is why I support H.R. 6028 and ask that my colleagues do so, because not only does it help to expedite. It helps to be efficient, but it is in conjunction with security. That is the right step in a collaborative way that we can work together. Again, I ask support for this legislation, and I yield back.
Gentlewoman yields back. Gentlewoman yields back. The gentleman from Mississippi.
Mr. Speaker, I have no more speakers. If the gentleman from Illinois has no more speakers, then I'm prepared to close.
I have no speakers.
Gentleman from Mississippi is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I such time as I may consume.
Gentleman's recognized.
Mr. Speaker, on this day, above all others, we turn our thoughts to those who were lost in the tragic events of 9/11. It is unfortunate that the House has missed the opportunity today to consider non-controversial Homeland Security legislation introduced by both Democrats and Republicans, thus showing that on 9/11 we put partisan politics aside and focused on doing the right thing. Before closing, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to extend my congratulations to the gentleman from Illinois, Representative Walsh, for having bills on the floor for consideration for the first time today. I suspect that he's surprised that I'm one of, I suspect that he is as surprised as I am that one of his first bills to reach the floor was proposed to Congress by the Obama administration. With that, Mr. Speaker, I urge passage of this proposal from the Obama administration and yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Illinois.
I thank the ranking member, and I urge all members, Mr. Speaker, to join me in support of this bipartisan bill, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. The question is, will the House suspend the rules and pass H.R. 6028 as amended? Those in favor say aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the Chair, two-thirds being in the affirmative, the rules are suspended. The bill is passed. And without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table. For what purpose does the gentleman from Pennsylvania seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I move to suspend the rules and pass S-710, the Hazardous Waste Electronic Manifest Establishment Act, as amended.
Clerk will report the title of the bill.
Senate 710, an act to amend the Solid Waste Disposal Act to direct the administrator of the Environmental Protection Agency to establish a hazardous waste electronic manifest system.
Pursuant to the rule, the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Murphy, and the gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Butterfield, will each control 20 minutes. The Chair recognizes the gentleman from Pennsylvania.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I ask unanimous consent that all members have 5 legislative days in which to revise and extend their remarks and insert extraneous materials in the record on S-710.
Without objection, so ordered.
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself as such time as I may consume.
Gentleman's recognized.
Mr. Speaker, enactment of S-710 will enable the EPA to employ current technology to sharply reduce paperwork, regulatory requirements, and at the same time it makes crucial information more accessible for states, first responders, and the public. When people create hazardous waste, we require them to carefully track the movement and disposition. That way we know that when a drum full of some hazardous waste is removed from a factory, the same amount winds up where it belongs, at a proper disposal facility, and that none of it is tossed into a sewer or a vacant lot. But for years, guaranteeing this actually happened meant keeping up with the reporting requirement, filling out multiple copies of paper forms, and mailing them to the EPA and state officials, as well as keeping paper copies at each place of business. The inefficiency of this system in today's electronic business-to-business world certainly stands out to anyone. In fact, we learned of a case when first responders arrived at the scene of a chemical plant fire and needed to know what substances were inside the plant before they started fighting the fire. In the whole city, the only copies of the forms identifying the hazardous waste were inside the building and were consumed in the fire. Now, there's got to be a better way. With an electronic system, instead of filling out long forms and mailing them, the critically needed data can be sent wherever it is needed with a few computer keystrokes. State regulators, first responders, and others will be able to pull it up on their computers and track the materials in real time. The changeover will not only save millions of dollars for regulated businesses, but quite frankly, it will save lives. So even though the e-manifest system in S710 is funded by user fees, I want to note it will not be a burden on small businesses. Users pay only when and to the extent they file manifests. Otherwise, the new system will work like the old paper system. The process to identify discrepancies in shipments is preserved. And Mr. Speaker, S710 was a good bill when it arrived here from the other body, but we made it better. First, we converted it from so-called mandatory spending to discretionary. That will allow our colleagues on the Appropriations Committee an annual chance to review the program and make sure that money collected from users and money spent on the system is only enough to get the job done. Next, working with our friends from the Committee on Transportation and Infrastructure, we added language to help the EPA harmonize its changeover to electronic filing with the Department of Transportation. DOT also has its own requirements for handling and reporting hazardous materials, and we want the agencies to talk to each other and their computers to speak the same language. So, Mr. Speaker, I urge the House to send S710 as amended back to the other body where we expect it to be approved without further amendment so that the President can sign it into law. Thank you, and I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from North Carolina.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I rise in strong support of the